Hi, starting with this video, we're going to move on to slightly less technical skills and more of the skills needed to work effectively in common IT jobs. So we're focusing now on looking at what verbal and non-verbal communication is and go through some key skills. So I think it's really tempting with these topics to completely think, well, actually, this is common sense. I can just skip this stuff, which you may do. You may feel you can skip this stuff, but I really do think there is stuff to learn and revise. So don't move on too quickly. So starting off with communication, right? Communication, we've talked about networking and we've talked about hardware and software, which involves transferring information. But human communication is really, really important. Of course, if you're working in jobs, you're interacting with people all of the time. So interpersonal skills are what we call the methods each of us use to communicate hopefully effectively with others. So somebody with good interpersonal skills is able to not quite get on well with other people, but is able to convey, to deliver information really effectively. And communication is often split into two categories. In reality, there are more. So the two we're going to focus on now are verbal and non-verbal. Now, verbal communication is like what's being depicted by probably this woman in this picture. Verbal communication is where you are using spoken words to communicate. I'm using it now, I'm speaking to you, but also have got, say, text on my screen. So that's why I say these aren't the only two. We've also got written methods, which we'll cover in the next video. But the other people in this picture, we can imagine demonstrating non-verbal communication, where they're using expressions, gestures, and other body language. Okay, so verbal, spoken, non-verbal, what's going on when you're not speaking. Now, written text is communication. It's non-verbal, but we don't usually consider it to be in this category. Written communication is really another category. Like I say, we'll cover it in the next video. So starting with verbal communication. Now, maybe stating the obvious a little bit, but your language, what you are saying, should vary depending on the context, right? All of us interact differently depending on where we are, who we are with, and even how we're feeling on that day. So we can look at two categories of language: formal language and technical language. So formal language, you're being very precise with your English. Your English is what we call standard. You're not really using very much slang. You are sticking to purely professional topics. Technical language is where you're using vocabulary which maybe other people who are not specialised would not know. So in terms of IT, there is lots and lots of acronyms and terms and concepts which somebody who's not familiar with IT would not know. So I've said, you'd probably, in a meeting with your superiors, which are your bosses, probably you would want to use formal and technical language. It might be your superiors don't know about IT, in which case you would use non-technical language. But that could be an example of where you'd be formal and technical. You might be informal and technical when you're discussing with people who are more close colleagues. So maybe people who are working with you are not above or below you. If you're having a group discussion where you are having a slightly more informal meeting, you might not need to be as formal. But if they are your colleagues and know the same stuff as you could be technical. Now, some people might argue you should never really be informal at work, but I feel like if you're working really closely with somebody, in reality, you're not going to be as formal as you would be with a customer or your boss. So I think informal is okay, as long as somebody is close and is a friend. But if you are talking with a customer, really, really important, you're being both formal and, in many cases, non-technical. So that means you are avoiding terms they might not know. If you drop in loads of terminology, it might confuse a customer who has no idea. So you try and explain stuff, you try and avoid jargon and acronyms and things they might not know. Of course, some customers might be really knowledgeable, and in that case, you could be technical. So these are all examples. If you are informal, of course, the customer might take offense. Now, another thing to consider are questioning techniques, especially if you're working in a management position or you're doing troubleshooting. Asking questions is a fairly important skill. So there are a few techniques I want to talk about. First of all, using open questions. An open question is where you are not expecting any particular answer. There's not a particular format you are expecting. And so open questions are used to get opinions and more detail. For instance, an open question might be, what do you think of Google Chrome? Could be an open question because you're asking for an opinion. There isn't a set answer you are necessarily expecting. Whereas a closed question is where you give options. Often yes or no, but you could give multiple choice options. Those are closed questions. So instead it might be, what browser do you use? Is it Safari, Chrome, or Edge? So giving 3 options, they choose one of those options. A third thing to be careful about are leading questions. So you should try and avoid leading questions. A leading question might pressure the respondent, the person you are speaking to, because a leading question has some bias. It includes your opinion in some way. You might say, what do you think about Google Chrome? Most people think it's the best browser. Or you might say, oh, aren't Apple the best company? Or isn't Android such a good operating system? You're giving your opinion in the question, which could pressure somebody. It can mean your answer is not as useful. Another thing which could affect the usefulness of your communication are certain barriers. So a barrier limits how effective your communication is. And there are loads of examples. I'll encourage you to think of some of your own. But some examples for verbal barriers include language. If somebody doesn't speak particularly good English, or they're not understanding your technical language, that will be a problem. If it's really noisy, you can't hear somebody, or if they're just quite quiet, if the microphone isn't working, something like that, that's not helpful. And also disabilities might affect understanding. If somebody is deaf, in quite an extreme example, they obviously can't hear you, but other, for example, learning difficulties might affect somebody's understanding. You might have to adapt your verbal communication. Now moving on to think about non-verbal quickly. So non-verbal, like I said at the start, includes body language. So your body language includes loads of stuff. It's what you are communicating with your body, hence the name. So things like facial expressions, your posture, and gestures. So to take an example of somebody speaking to a big audience, they are speaking, but they're also doing a lot of non-verbal communication using body language. So your facial expressions are what you are showing on your face, smiling, frowning, looking happy, sad, angry. You might feel really nervous doing a big speech, but if you look calm and you look happy, that can make quite a big difference. Your posture is how you are presenting your body. Are you sitting up straight? Are you standing straight? Are you slumped over? A strong posture makes you look confident and professional. And your gestures are what you're doing with your hands, usually. So if you've got your hands in your pockets or they're not moving at all, that might look a little bit unnatural and not very confident. If you're moving them around in a natural way, that can look, again, professional. The second main aspect of non-verbal communication is eye contact, where you are looking at somebody else's eyes. These names are quite straightforward to understand. So eye contact, some people, of course, find it really easy. Other people might find it hard, and there could be some barriers involved, of course. But eye contact can be used to show you're listening. So if you're sat in the audience, it can be quite reassuring to the person speaking if they are looking at you and you can get eye contact. But also if you are in a conversation, it can often be used to make other people feel included. If you are having a group discussion and you are looking at the speaker or looking at somebody else, it's a slightly nicer thing to do than looking away or looking down. It can show you're not involved. Of course, too much eye contact would be a little bit off-putting, perhaps, if you're staring at somebody. But some more barriers, which, again, there are loads more, so please do think of some more. But the main ones I was thinking of are distraction. So if you're not listening, you're not focused, you're looking away, you're going to miss body language. So if you're not concentrating you're going to miss somebody's gesture or looking mad at you or whatever it is. But also I think, thinking in a slightly bigger picture, verbal communication is fine over things like phone calls and voice notes and teleconferencing software. But if you've got virtual communication like those, you can't see the person, and so non-verbal communication goes out the window, really. Even things like video conferencing, things like Zoom and Teams, you can see the person if they've got a webcam, but still you're missing stuff. You can only see their face, you're missing their gestures maybe, you're missing their posture to a certain extent is not as clear, even with these more visual virtual communication methods.